The village of Nkasi had never seen such a flurry of activity. The sun rose earlier than usual, casting golden light over the dusty roads and humble mud-brick homes, illuminating a community swept up in a whirlwind of celebration. Flags of bright reds, yellows, and greens fluttered on wooden poles, and the scent of spiced food mingled with the fresh earth. Everyone, from children to elders, was caught in the joyful momentum of preparing for the grand wedding of Amina, the daughter of the respected village elder. In the heart of the village, the elder's compound was a hive of motion and noise. Women embroidered intricate patterns onto flowing fabrics, men hammered stakes for tents, and boys ran errands with bundles of palm leaves and strings of beads. Drums, both small and large, were tuned meticulously, their skins stretched taut to produce the perfect celebratory beats. The marketplace bustled, with traders arriving early to offer gifts of kola nuts, yams, and goat meat. The entire village buzzed with anticipation. Yet, beneath the vibrancy, there were shadows that no one spoke of openly. In the same compound lived Zuri, Amina's younger sister. Unlike her radiant elder sibling, Zuri was quiet, reserved, and often overlooked. Her clothes were simpler, her smiles fewer, and her presence less pronounced. She had spent years in the background, absorbing the energy of her sister's world but never quite invited to join it. The preparations only heightened her sense of invisibility. Each morning, as the village came alive with a chorus of song and laughter, Zuri found herself pushed to the edges, assigned to the menial tasks of cleaning, fetching water, and setting tables. Though she worked tirelessly, her efforts were barely noticed. The women of the village, particularly those closest to Amina, whispered about her as if she were a shadow too dull to shine in the wedding's bright light. Zuri's heart was a complicated mix of love, envy, and resentment. She admired her sister's grace and the way people smiled at her, but she also felt the sting of being diminished, treated more like a servant than family. The contrast between them was sharp, as if fate had chosen to bind one with golden threads and the other with invisible chains. As the wedding day drew near, Zuri's unease grew. Rumors spread that she was to wear chains during the ceremony, an ancient and harsh tradition meant to mark a lesser status, a punishment whispered about but rarely enforced. The village elders justified the practice as a reminder of order and respect, but to Zuri, it felt like a sentence. She wondered why the happiness surrounding her sister's wedding could not reach her, why the bonds she was given were not of silk but of cold, heavy metal. Her parents had long since passed, leaving the sisters alone under the watchful eyes of the elder and the community. Without the protection of parental love, Zuri's vulnerability deepened. She tried to speak with Amina, hoping for sisterly comfort, but Amina was caught in the whirlwind of her own excitement and social obligations. Their conversations were short, polite, and tinged with a distance neither wanted but both accepted. At night, when the village quieted and the stars spilled across the sky, Zuri would sit by the fire, her fingers tracing patterns in the ash. She thought about the coming day, about the drums that would beat loud and proud, and about the chain she would wear that no one else would notice, except her. A lump formed in her throat, and she swallowed the bitterness of loneliness and impending humiliation. The women who prepared her wedding attire treated her with the same cold detachment as the rest. They wrapped her in a simple dress, plain against the colorful robes of the other guests, and fastened the cold chains around her wrists and ankles with deliberate care. The metal links clinked softly, a sound that echoed louder in Zuri's heart than any drumbeat. Outside, the village danced and sang, oblivious to the quiet storm gathering within one of their own. As lanterns were hung and fires prepared for the evening's feast, Zuri stood at the edge of the celebration, a figure marked by chains and silence, overshadowed but not yet broken. The wedding was to be a day of joy and unity, but for her, it was the beginning of a trial that would test the very strength of her spirit. The morning sun cast a pale light over the village of Nkasi, but it did little to warm the heavy cloud hanging over Zuri's heart. As the preparations for her sister Amina's wedding reached their peak, a cruel decree was made, one that would mark Zuri not with joy but with shame. The elders, bound by tradition and whispers of maintaining social order, had decided that Zuri would wear heavy iron chains throughout the wedding day. The announcement came abruptly. At the break of dawn, the village elder, flanked by other respected elders, summoned Zuri to the courtyard. The murmurs of the gathered crowd hushed into silence as the decree was read aloud. The chains were to symbolize her lesser position within the family and village hierarchy, a visible punishment for unspecified slights and perceived disobedience in the past. It was an ancient custom, seldom enforced but remembered well enough to serve as a weapon of control. Zuri's heart pounded with disbelief and humiliation. The air seemed to thicken as she was led to a small room where the chains awaited, cold, heavy, and unyielding. The iron links were coarse and thick, with rough edges that promised discomfort and pain. As the blacksmith secured the heavy shackles around her wrists and ankles, each clink of metal against metal sounded like a hammer blow to her dignity. Her body tensed involuntarily as the weight settled on her limbs. The chains were heavier than she had imagined, dragging at her movements and pinching her skin. The cold metal bit into her wrists, leaving angry red marks almost instantly. Her fingers trembled, partly from fear, partly from the sting of the unforgiving iron. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless. Her mind swirled with a storm of emotions: humiliation, anger, sadness, and a desperate flicker of defiance. She clenched her jaw to hold back tears, but the bitter sting in her eyes betrayed her silent suffering. Around her, the women preparing the wedding garments and ornaments looked on with indifferent eyes, some exchanging knowing glances that deepened her sense of isolation. As the chains were fastened, Zuri tried to steady her breathing. Every movement was a challenge. The weight slowed her steps, the shackles rattled and clanked, and the rough iron scraped against her ankles. The pain was immediate, but the emotional wound was deeper. To be paraded in chains at her sister's wedding was a public spectacle of shame that no words could erase. She thought of Amina, radiant and free, adorned in silks and jewels, laughing and surrounded by admirers. How could their fates be so starkly different? The sister she had once idolized now seemed distant and untouchable, a symbol of everything Zuri was not allowed to be. The chains felt like a physical manifestation of the gulf between them. Despite the heavy burden, Zuri's spirit flickered stubbornly. She refused to let the chains break her will. Quietly, she vowed to carry her humiliation with as much grace as she could muster. She recalled the stories her mother had once told her about women who endured great hardship with quiet strength, and she clung to those tales like a lifeline. The journey from the preparation room to the wedding hall was a slow, painful procession. The chains dragged and rattled with each step, drawing eyes and gasps from the crowd. Some looked away uncomfortably, others whispered cruelly about her supposed faults. Children pointed and laughed, their innocent cruelty cutting as sharply as any blade. As she walked through the village paths lined with friends and family gathered for the celebration, Zuri felt the weight of not just iron, but of judgment, expectation, and sorrow. Every clink of the chains was a reminder of the harshness of tradition and the pain of being cast out. Inside the wedding hall, the bright colors and jubilant music contrasted starkly with the dull metallic sheen around her wrists and ankles. Guests swayed to the drums, voices lifted in song, and dancers twirled, but Zuri stood still, a figure bound and restrained amid the revelry. The warmth of the celebration felt like a distant memory, replaced by the cold reality of chains and isolation. Her body ached, her skin raw from the metal's bite, but the deeper ache was in her soul. Each moment felt endless, a test of endurance and courage. She fought the urge to cry out or plead, knowing that her silence was the only dignity she had left. The elders watched closely, satisfied that the punishment served its purpose, but in the shadows some villagers whispered uneasily. The sight of a young woman chained during a wedding stirred feelings beyond pride and tradition. It touched something raw and unsettling in their hearts. As the day wore on, the chains became not just instruments of shame but unexpected symbols of resistance. Zuri's quiet endurance spoke louder than the festive drums. Though bound, her spirit refused to be crushed, and the metal that constrained her body could not silence the fire burning within. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the sky a flawless canvas of blue stretched over the village of Nkasi. From the earliest hours, the sounds of celebration filled the air: laughter, music, and the rhythmic pounding of drums that echoed through the streets and fields. It was a day that should have been woven with joy and hope, a day for uniting families and creating new beginnings. But for Zuri, it was a day marked by heavy chains and silent endurance. As the sun climbed higher, the village transformed into a kaleidoscope of color and life. Banners and woven tapestries fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the scent of roasting goat and sweet spices wafted from every corner. Women dressed in vibrant Kent cloths, their necks adorned with beads that caught the sunlight, danced in circles while singing traditional songs of celebration. The men, clad in flowing igbadas, clapped their hands and stomped their feet, adding a powerful heartbeat to the festivities. Children darted between the legs of adults, their faces painted with bright patterns, carrying small gifts wrapped in banana leaves. The entire village had gathered to witness the marriage of Amina, the elder daughter of the village chief, whose grace and beauty were spoken of in hushed admiration. The wedding was a grand affair, one that would be remembered for years to come. Amid this swirl of happiness and music, Zuri sat chained near the edge of the gathering, a silent shadow against the vibrant tapestry of celebration. The heavy iron shackles bound her wrists and ankles, their weight a constant reminder of her place in this joyous event, not as a participant, but as a spectacle of disgrace. She was forced to remain in a corner, away from the dancing and feasting, condemned to watch as her sister basked in the warmth of the crowd's adoration. Her eyes traced the swirling skirts and the fluttering ribbons of dancers, the rhythmic sway of hips and the tapping of feet. The drums called out in booming waves, and the village singers' voices rose in a chorus of praise and blessing. Yet, in the midst of this jubilation, Zuri felt the cold grip of isolation tighten around her heart. The clink of her chains echoed faintly, drowned out by the overwhelming sounds of celebration, but in her ears, it was a constant drumbeat of shame. Each movement was a struggle, turning her head to glimpse her sister's radiant smile, shifting her weight on aching ankles, or wiping the sting from her reddened wrists where the iron bit into her skin. The chains were more than physical restraints. They were a barrier between her and the life unfolding just beyond reach. Guests moved around her, some avoiding her gaze, others casting furtive glances of pity or disdain. Children were hushed when they neared, warned by elders not to mock the chained girl, but the whispers and pointed fingers never ceased. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, a strange blend of celebration and unease. From time to time, a brave few approached Zuri, offering small nods or words of sympathy. An older woman laid a gentle hand on her shoulder, whispering a blessing meant to strengthen her spirit. A young boy brought a handful of wildflowers, placing them quietly beside her chained feet before slipping away. These small acts of kindness were like fragile threads of hope woven into the heavy fabric of her humiliation. Across the hall, Amina moved with effortless grace, her laughter ringing clear above the din. She was dressed in silk robes embroidered with gold thread, her hair adorned with fragrant jasmine blossoms. Around her neck hung a necklace of polished amber beads that caught the firelight, and her eyes sparkled with the promise of a new life. She was the center of attention, the beloved daughter, the soon-to-be bride. Zuri's gaze followed her sister, a mixture of love and sorrow twisting inside her. The gulf between them seemed as vast as the sky above. While Amina danced and was showered with gifts, Zuri remained chained and silent, a living reminder of harsh traditions and unspoken grievances. The feast began in earnest, with long wooden tables groaning under platters of roasted meat, bowls of sweet yam porridge, and baskets overflowing with freshly baked bread. Guests ate and drank, raising their cups in toasts to the couple's happiness and prosperity. The air was thick with the scent of palm wine and incense, and the chatter of relatives and friends filled every corner. Despite the festive atmosphere, Zuri remained untouched by the merriment. She watched as food was passed around, her stomach tightening with hunger that went unanswered. The chains prevented her from moving freely or reaching for anything beyond her immediate grasp. She could only sip water brought to her by a kind servant, her appetite dulled by the weight of shame and pain. As the afternoon wore on, the music shifted to slower, more soulful songs. The drums beat softer rhythms and dancers moved with deliberate grace, telling stories of love, loss, and resilience through their fluid motions. Zuri's eyes watered as she watched, the music stirring a deep ache within her, a yearning for freedom, for belonging, for a life beyond these chains. Then, unexpectedly, a hush fell over the crowd. The vibrant drumbeats were joined by a new sound, the soft, rhythmic clinking of metal. Eyes turned toward Zuri, whose chains began to rattle gently in time with the music. At first, the sound was faint, almost unnoticed amid the celebration, but it grew steadily louder, drawing curious glances and murmurs. The chains sang, a haunting melody that seemed to rise from Zuri's very soul. It was a song of pain and endurance, of silent strength beneath heavy burdens. The music wrapped around the wedding hall like a veil, silencing the drums and stilling the dancers. Faces turned toward her, some filled with awe, others with fear or disbelief. Zuri's heart swelled with a strange mixture of shame and power. The chains that had been meant to humiliate now spoke for her, their song louder than the drums, carrying her story beyond whispered gossip and judgment. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting the eyes of those who watched, and in that moment she was no longer just the girl in chains, she was a voice, a presence, a force to be reckoned with. The wedding continued, but the energy had shifted. The guests no longer saw her as merely a burden or an outcast. They glimpsed the quiet fire burning within her. The chains, once symbols of oppression, had become instruments of revelation, singing truths that words could not express. As the sun began to set and lanterns were lit, Casting a warm glow over the village, Zuri remained seated, the chains gently chiming in the evening breeze. Around her, the wedding thrummed with life, but she had found a moment of transcendence amid the turmoil, a moment where her spirit rose above the chains and the music itself. The wedding hall, once filled with lively music and laughter, had fallen into a heavy silence. The last lingering notes of the chains' haunting melody seemed to hang in the air like a tangible presence, echoing the unspoken pain and resilience that Zuri bore so silently throughout the day. Eyes that had been cast downward or averted now turned sharply toward her, wide with shock and a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd, low at first, then growing steadily louder as more villagers gathered to witness the unexpected spectacle. The once carefree guests were now caught in a web of conflicting emotions: wonder at the beauty of the chain's song, fear of what it might mean, and a dawning sense of guilt over the harshness of the punishment that had bound the young woman. Some whispered among themselves, voices trembling as they exchanged theories. "Is this witchcraft?" one woman asked in a hushed tone, her eyes flickering with apprehension. "No, it must be a sign from the ancestors," an elder muttered, gripping his staff tightly, the lines of worry deepening on his face. Why would the chains sing unless she was innocent? Others exchanged glances, the weight of their judgment suddenly feeling heavier than before. The villagers who had earlier shouted and jeered at Zuri now hesitated, their bravado faltering as the melody's echo reached into their consciences. The very chains meant to humiliate her had become a voice too powerful to ignore. Children, usually the most uninhibited in their behavior, stood still, some holding their mother's hands tightly. The playful whispers that once mocked Zuri's fate were replaced with awed silence. A young girl clutched a small wooden doll, her wide eyes fixed on the chained woman, sensing something extraordinary but not yet fully understanding. Amina, radiant in her bridal finery, felt a pang of conflicted emotion. She had grown up alongside Zuri, yet the day's events had driven a wedge between them, a wedge carved by family tension and silent resentments. Now, seeing her sister's chains singing a song of both pain and dignity, Amina's heart tightened. Her smile faltered as she questioned the justice of the punishment she had silently approved. Nearby, a group of village elders gathered in a tight circle, their faces grim and voices low. The head elder, a man known for his wisdom and fairness, stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Perhaps we have been too harsh," he murmured, his eyes fixed on Zuri. "The chains have spoken in a way no one expected. This is not merely punishment, it is a message." Among the crowd, some villagers nodded in agreement, their previous certainty shaken. A young hunter, who had often stood guard at the village entrance, whispered to his friend, "I saw her feeding the sick animals and helping the old woman last month. She is more kind than many of us." Fear mingled with fascination as people began to reconsider their judgments. What if the punishment was unjust? What if the chained song was a cry for understanding rather than a mark of guilt? These questions spread quietly but surely, casting doubt on the harsh traditions that had long governed the village. Yet not all were ready to accept this change. A few voices rose in protest, sharp and defensive. "She is bound for a reason," one man shouted, his face flushed with anger. "If we show weakness, who will respect the rules? Punishment must be firm." The queen's cousin, a stern woman with cold eyes, scowled as she whispered harsh words to her companions, dismissing the chain's melody as trickery. Her presence reminded many that power and tradition were deeply entwined, and challenging them came with risks. Meanwhile, Zuri remained seated, the weight of the chains still pressing against her skin, but her spirit bolstered by the sudden shift in the crowd's demeanor. She met the curious glances without fear, sensing that her silent endurance had awakened something within those who had once turned away. As the sun began its slow descent, casting golden light across the faces of the villagers, the whispers continued to grow, transforming the wedding celebration into a moment of reflection. The once unquestioned punishment was now a subject of debate and empathy. The chains, with their unexpected song, had opened a door, one that invited the village to reconsider the balance between tradition and compassion. The guests realized that the story they had come to celebrate was no longer just about the bride and groom, but also about the quiet strength of the girl bound in chains, whose voice could not be silenced. And so, amidst the fading music and the flickering lanterns, the whispers and stares wove together, planting seeds of change that would ripple through Nkasi for years to come. Amina stood at the far side of the wedding hall, draped in her shimmering gown that caught the golden light of the setting sun. Around her, laughter and music had dimmed to a soft murmur, but her world felt impossibly loud and hollow. Her eyes were fixed on Zuri, her younger sister, who sat bound in heavy iron chains, now singing their haunting melody. The chains were no longer just cold metal. They had become a voice that spoke louder than drums, and in that voice, Amina heard truths she was reluctant to face. For years, Amina had held tightly to the role carved out for her by their family and village. The favored daughter, the one destined for glory through marriage. Zuri, quiet and gentle, was the shadow behind her brilliance, the sister she barely noticed beyond duty and competition. But now, as the chain song wove through the air, Amina felt something unravel inside her, a mixture of guilt, jealousy, and an aching denial. She tried to remember the moments before this day, the stolen glances, the whispered fights, the silent accusations. Was it jealousy that had fueled the cruel decision to chain Zuri during the wedding? Or was it the village's rigid customs and her own fear of being overshadowed? The weight of those chains was not just physical, it pressed upon Amina's conscience. Amina's heart pounded as she watched villagers turn their heads away from the bride and groom and toward Zuri. The chains had become the true centerpiece of the celebration, commanding attention and stirring emotions that no song or dance could evoke. It was as if Zuri's pain had been transformed into power, a silent rebellion that no one could ignore. The bride's smile faltered, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. She felt exposed beneath the stares and whispers, her carefully constructed image cracking. The pride she had carried like armor was beginning to feel fragile in the face of her sister's quiet strength. Inside her, a fierce storm raged. Shame at her role in the punishment. Envy for the unexpected sympathy Zuri was gaining. A yearning to reach out and make amends, tangled with the fear of losing her place in the village's esteem. Memories flooded back, times when Zuri had shown kindness even when neglected, when she had defended Amina quietly from village gossip, and moments when their bond had flickered like a fragile flame. Those memories clashed with the present, making Amina question everything she had believed about herself, her sister, and the family they came from. The guests' whispers grew louder, discussing the fairness of the chains and the message their song carried. Some looked to Amina, expecting her to speak or act, but she remained silent, trapped by pride and uncertainty. Her silence was a language of its own, one that spoke of denial and unresolved pain. Amina's gaze softened as she caught sight of Zuri's eyes, steady, unyielding, and somehow forgiving. The chains that once symbolized disgrace now radiated dignity. A wave of emotion broke through Amina's defenses, and she realized that her sister's strength had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Tears welled up, blurring her vision, but she blinked them away. She was the bride, the center of celebration, but in this moment, the true light belonged to the girl in chains. The revelation was both humbling and unsettling. As the melody of the chains echoed through the hall once more, Amina took a small step forward, her heart beating with the possibility of reconciliation and change. The silence she had maintained was no longer an option. The wedding was no longer just about vows and festivities, it was a turning point for both sisters and the village that watched them. Amid the crowd's shifting gaze, Amina's conflicted emotions unfolded, a portrait of jealousy tempered by love, guilt softened by hope, and denial giving way to acceptance. The sisters' silence was breaking, and with it came the promise of a new chapter, one where chains might one day be replaced by understanding and healing. The evening deepened, and the wedding hall seemed to pulse with a strange energy that no one could quite explain. The once celebratory drums, the heartbeat of the village's joy, began to falter beneath the growing resonance of the chains. Each link clinked and rattled in rhythm, but unlike before, the melody had grown into a powerful soaring song that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of every guest present. The crowd was no longer mere spectators. They were witnesses to something transcendent. The chains, heavy and cold, had become instruments of a greater force, one that sang not only of pain but of fierce endurance and unyielding spirit. With every note, the sound drowned out the drumming, silencing the traditional music and pulling every ear toward Zuri. Zuri herself was transformed. Her eyes, once cast downward in silent suffering, now shone with an inner fire. The weight of the metal did not bend her will. Instead, it seemed to fuel a strength that radiated from deep within. Her chest rose and fell with steady breath, and her fingers curled lightly around the iron links, as if conducting the song that poured from the chains. The villagers felt the shift viscerally. Mothers clutched their children closer, and elders leaned forward, their eyes wide with awe and fear. The younger men who had jeered earlier, stood frozen, unable to look away from the spectacle. The dancers paused mid-step and the singers fell silent, the usual rhythms crushed beneath the crescendo of the chain's melody. Amina, the bride, watched from her place, her heart pounding wildly. The joy of her wedding had been eclipsed by the undeniable force emanating from her sister. A swirl of emotions overwhelmed her: pride, shame, fear, and a deep, aching love that broke through the walls she had built. The queen's cousin, a woman known for her sharp tongue and rigid beliefs, stood with a sneer frozen on her face, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "This is witchcraft," she hissed. "Mark my words, this girl has called upon dark forces to mock us all." But the head elder, who had watched quietly from the beginning, raised a hand for silence. His gaze was steady, reflecting wisdom earned over many years. "No," he said firmly. "This is the voice of truth and endurance. The chains do not sing to curse but to reveal." As the song grew louder, the very air around the hall seemed to vibrate. The light flickered in the lanterns, and the earth beneath their feet hummed softly. Some villagers felt a tingling warmth spread through their bodies, as though the chain's song carried healing power. From the edges of the crowd, a group of children began to hum along, their innocent voices joining the melody in a gentle harmony. This small chorus sparked a ripple of courage among the guests, and soon others found themselves humming too, voices rising to meet the chain's song. Zuri's spirit soared on this wave of collective energy. Her chains, once instruments of punishment and humiliation, had become the conduit for a powerful anthem of resilience. The melody was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every soul in the hall who had suffered injustice, who had been silenced or cast aside. As the final notes rang out, the wedding drums fell completely silent. A profound stillness settled over the village, an unspoken acknowledgement that something sacred had occurred. The chain's song had broken through the noise of tradition and prejudice, demanding recognition and change. Tears streamed down Amina's face as she rose slowly, stepping toward her sister. The space between them, once filled with rivalry and pain, was now bridged by understanding and shared strength. The guests watched in stunned silence as the bride reached out, fingers trembling, to touch the cool metal that bound Zuri. Zuri met her gaze, a faint smile touching her lips. The chains no longer defined her. They sang for her freedom, her dignity, and the unbreakable bond between two sisters. In that moment, the wedding celebration transformed. It became a testament to courage, to the power of voice over silence, and to the enduring spirit that refuses to be chained. The silence after the chain's final haunting note hung in the air like a held breath. No one moved at first. Even the torches seemed to burn more quietly, their flickering light trembling against the walls as if unsure whether to illuminate what had just happened. The drummers sat frozen, their hands hovering above their instruments. The dancers stood rooted to the spot, their eyes locked on the young woman at the center of it all, the sister in chains. Zuri stood tall despite the weight pressing down on her shoulders and ankles. Her breathing was steady, her gaze unwavering. There was no triumph in her expression, no mocking smile for those who had shamed her, only the same quiet dignity she had carried since the moment she was forced to wear those iron links. That was what unsettled the crowd the most. She had endured their cruelty without bowing her head, and now she stood as if she had never been touched by it at all. It was an old woman in the front row who moved first. Bent-backed and wrapped in a shawl patched with care, she shuffled forward. No one stopped her. The hush in the air felt too sacred to break with objection. When she reached Zuri, the woman placed a hand gently over the cold metal that bound the girl's wrists. Her eyes filled with tears. "My child," she said, her voice breaking, "these chains are not yours to bear." Her words rippled through the crowd like a pebble dropped into still water. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man at the back, a fisherman whose weathered hands were stained with years of salt and sun, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "She has more strength than any of us," he declared. "And we dressed it in iron as if it were shame." The murmurs began. At first they were just whispers, fragments of sentences too soft to catch entirely. But the sound grew, swelled. Soon the guests were speaking openly, their voices carrying the weight of recognition and regret. "She has stood here without flinching. She sang without a voice. This is no curse, it's a blessing we tried to bury." The transformation in the air was palpable. The oppressive cloud of judgment and ceremony shifted, becoming something raw and electric. People began rising from their seats, not to join in the dancing but to draw closer to Zuri. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, asking why the chains made music. Young men who had smirked earlier now kept their eyes low, shame gnawing at their insides. At the edges of the courtyard, the wedding musicians sat in quiet awe. One of the drummers, still clutching his sticks, tapped them gently together. The faint rhythm he made seemed to fall in step with the memory of the chain's melody, and without realizing it, others began to echo it, Soft foot taps, a hum from someone leaning on the wall, a low note from a flute player who had abandoned his tune earlier. The wedding, once filled with choreographed joy, was now something else entirely. It had become a gathering of awakening hearts, an assembly not of revelry but of reckoning. It was no longer about the bride's beauty, the feast's abundance, or the prestige of the family. It was about the truth that had been laid bare by the chain's song. Amina, the bride, stood near the dais, her veil trembling slightly as she clutched it in both hands. She looked at Zuri and then at the crowd that now seemed to be orbiting her sister. Their eyes, once focused on her in admiration, now gazed at Zuri with a reverence Amina had never commanded. The realization stung, but alongside it bloomed a strange pride. This was her sister, the same girl she had watched grow up, laugh under the mango trees, dream aloud by the riverside. And here she was, transforming humiliation into something untouchable. The chains shifted as Zuri adjusted her stance, and the faint jingle reignited the murmurs. More guests came forward, some to offer a touch of reassurance, others to bow their heads in apology. A few knelt, their gestures carrying the weight of confession. No one dared to remove the chains just yet, as if they feared breaking the magic that had silenced an entire village. One of the elders, his deep-lined face framed by white hair, finally addressed the crowd. "We are witnessing more than music," he said. "We are hearing the truth of our hearts reflected back at us. She was meant to be diminished, yet she stands greater than the day we cast judgment upon her." People nodded. A woman in the second row, clutching her baby to her chest, wiped tears from her eyes. "If the chains can sing, then maybe so can we," she whispered to the child, who cooed as though in agreement. A group of young girls, emboldened by the shift in atmosphere, began softly tapping their bracelets and anklets together, creating a delicate counterpoint to the imagined rhythm still hanging in the air. Soon, others joined in, men with their rings against cups, women with their bangles, until the space was filled with a gentle, shimmering chorus that wove itself around Zuri like a crown of sound. It was not joy in the traditional sense. It was not the noisy, wine-soaked merriment of weddings past. This was something cleaner, sharper, a celebration of survival, of truth laid bare. It was the kind of awakening that once felt could never be forgotten. The bride's groom, who had stood silently watching from his place beside Amina, finally stepped forward. His embroidered robe swayed slightly as he moved through the crowd. When he reached Zuri, he bowed, not the shallow nod of politeness but a deep, full bow that signaled respect. "You have brought more honor to this day than all the gold we wear," he said simply. The guests, hearing his words, seemed to understand that the wedding had shifted into something greater than itself. The feast would still be eaten, the dances still danced, but the true heart of the day now belonged to Zuri and the message her chains had sung. And as night settled over the village, lantern light glimmering against the polished iron, it was no longer the drums people heard in their minds, but the ringing, resilient song of chains, proof that dignity, once awakened, could not be silenced. The night had deepened, and the wedding courtyard glowed beneath a halo of lantern light. The air carried that peculiar stillness that comes when a crowd is on the edge of something monumental. People stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath mingling in the cool darkness, their eyes fixed on Zuri. The chains that had been meant to weigh her down now gleamed like silver serpents in the flickering firelight, each link catching and throwing back the light as if reluctant to be forgotten. The murmurs that had swirled earlier had faded into silence. Even the crickets beyond the stone walls seemed to have paused, as though nature itself was holding its breath. In the heart of that stillness, Zuri shifted her weight. The soft chime of the chains was enough to ripple through the gathered crowd like a whisper passed from ear to ear. She stood taller now than she had at the start of the day, though the iron links still hung heavy from her wrists and ankles. She felt their weight, but she no longer feared it. In her chest, there was no room for the shame that had once wrapped itself around her ribs like a second set of chains. That had burned away, replaced by something steady and warm, something she recognized as her own truth. The elder who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, his staff tapping the ground in a slow, deliberate rhythm. His weathered face was lit from below by a nearby torch, throwing deep shadows that made his eyes gleam. "There are burdens placed upon us by others," he said, his voice carrying easily through the open air, "and there are burdens we carry by choice. These chains were never yours, child. They were forged by envy and tightened by ignorance, but I believe they will not remain." He turned to the crowd, sweeping his gaze over them like a tide. "You have heard their song. You have felt it in your bones. Do you still believe they belong?" The crowd shifted. There was no shout, no roaring answer, just the low hum of agreement, a sound like the earth itself murmuring assent. Somewhere in the front, a man said, "No," then another voice, firmer this time, "No." Soon, the word moved from mouth to mouth, growing stronger until it was a chorus that seemed to fill the courtyard. Zuri closed her eyes. She didn't pray, at least not in the way she had as a child, but she let the sound of their voices wrap around her like a warm blanket. And then, something shifted. It began with a faint vibration in the metal. At first, she thought it was her own pulse echoing in the cuffs around her wrists. But the trembling grew, until it felt as though the chains themselves were alive, shivering in anticipation. She opened her eyes to see that the links were moving, ever so slightly but unmistakably, like reeds swaying in an unseen current. Gasps rose from the crowd. People stepped back, making space around her as though giving the chains room to breathe. The iron links rattled, not in the harsh, clattering way of burden, but in a rhythm that was almost musical, echoing the melody they had sung earlier. Then, with a sound that was neither snap nor tear but something deeper, like stones splitting under the pressure of a growing tree, the first cuff fell away from her wrist. It hit the ground with a heavy thud, sending up a puff of dust. The other cuff followed moments later, the metal ring dropping free without leaving so much as a mark on her skin. The crowd let out a collective cry of astonishment. Some covered their mouths, others reached out as though to touch the fallen links but stopped themselves, afraid of disturbing the moment. Zuri's ankles were next. The chains there began to glow faintly in the firelight, the dull iron brightening as though heated from within. The sound they made grew louder, almost joyous, until the final length gave way and fell in two perfect halves at her feet. The earth seemed to sigh in relief beneath her bare toes. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The only sound was the faint ringing still echoing in the air, as if the chain's song lingered even after they were gone. Then a child's voice piped up from the side, small, clear, and full of wonder. "She's free." The words broke whatever spell had held the crowd still. People surged forward, not in a threatening rush, but with the kind of urgency that comes when you witness a miracle and need to be close to it. Hands reached out to her, some in reverence, others in apology. Tears shone in more than a few eyes. Amina, her sister, stood rooted at the far end of the courtyard. She had not moved during the breaking. Her veil now hung loose, the pins barely clinging to her dark hair. Slowly she made her way forward. Every step she took seemed to cost her something, but she did not stop until she stood before Zuri. The sisters locked eyes. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Amina reached down, picked up one of the broken links and pressed it into Zuri's palm. "I thought these would make you small," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crowd. "I didn't know they would make you greater." Zuri closed her fingers around the link. It was surprisingly light now, as though all the malice and shame once poured into it had been burned away. She did not answer her sister's words, not with speech. Instead, she took a slow step forward, standing so that her shoulders were square and her head was held high. The elder raised his staff again. "Look well," he told the crowd. "For this is what freedom looks like, not given but claimed. Not begged for but earned. And once claimed, it cannot be taken again." A cheer rose then, not the awkward, scattered applause of forced celebration, but a full-bodied roar that rolled through the courtyard and into the night. It was a sound of release, of recognition, of something long overdue. The musicians, caught up in the moment, began to play, not the planned wedding songs but something new and raw. The drummers found a rhythm that matched the steady beat of hearts still pounding from what they'd witnessed. Flutes joined in, weaving through the percussive heartbeat with notes that rose and soared like a bird freed from its cage. Zuri stood in the center of it all, feeling the music wrap around her. Her chains were gone but their song remained, no longer a lament but a hymn of power. She breathed deeply, tasting the night air without the metallic tang of iron. Her body felt lighter, yes, but more than that, her spirit seemed to have expanded, filling every inch of her being and spilling out into the space around her. As the celebration continued, people began to gather the broken links from the ground. Some strung them into necklaces, others held them as keepsakes. No one spoke of melting them down or hiding them away. The chains were no longer symbols of shame but relics of a victory that belonged to everyone who had stood witness. The wedding feast resumed, though it bore little resemblance to what had been planned. People spoke to each other with a new gentleness, a new attentiveness. When Zuri moved through the crowd, they stepped aside with respect, not pity. And when she finally sat down, it was not in the shadows at the edges of the courtyard but at the main table, beside her sister and the groom. The night wore on, but the memory of the moment when the chains fell away would live far longer than the music or the food or the dancing. It would become a story told by firelight, a lesson passed down, that no matter how heavy the weight, there are forces, seen and unseen, that will rise to break it when the spirit refuses to yield. The village awoke slowly the next morning, as though reluctant to let go of the strange and beautiful dream from the night before. The dawn light spilled over the thatched rooftops in soft ribbons, glinting off puddles left from the previous evening's dew. The air was fresh, scented faintly with wood smoke and the remnants of roasted meat from the wedding feast. But beneath that ordinary calm lay the pulse of something new, a shared awareness that the world, at least their small part of it, had shifted. Zuri rose before most, the habit of early rising etched into her bones from years of chores and quiet endurance. Her bare feet touched the cool earth outside her door, and for the first time in years, there was no clinking or dragging sound to follow her movements. She could still feel where the chains had hung, but the sensation was no longer physical. It was a ghost of a weight, a memory that no longer stung. In place of that heaviness was something else, the murmur of the villagers' voices from last night, the way they had reached for her not with scorn but with awe. When she stepped into the village square, she noticed immediately that people were looking at her. Not the glances of gossip she was used to, the kind that slid away quickly as though contact might soil the watcher, but open, steady gazes. There was curiosity in their eyes, yes, but also a measure of respect she had never been offered before. Some gave small nods as she passed, others smiled outright. An older woman pressed a fresh piece of bread into Zuri's hands without a word. A young boy, perhaps no older than 7, trailed after her for a few paces before shyly offering her a small daisy, his cheeks red. She accepted each gesture quietly, not yet sure how to wear this new skin of being seen differently. By mid-morning, she found herself summoned to the large meeting hut, where the elders sat on woven mats in a semicircle. Her sister Amina was there, still in the embroidered dress from the wedding, though the fine veil was gone and her hair hung loose over her shoulders. She looked tired, perhaps from the weight of her own thoughts as much as from the day before. The groom sat beside her, silent, his eyes flicking between the sisters. The head elder, the same one whose voice had cut through the air when the chains began to stir, spoke first. "Zuri," he said, his tone formal but warm, "last night we witnessed something that no one in this village will forget. The chains that were meant to mark you as less became your triumph. We cannot pretend it did not happen, nor can we return to how things were before." His words settled in the air like dust after a storm. Zuri glanced at her sister, but Amina's expression was unreadable. Another elder leaned forward. "Some may say it was magic. Others may call it fate. Whatever it was, it revealed your strength and shamed those who sought to break you. For this you have our respect." Zuri felt a small knot in her chest loosen. Respect was not an apology, but it was a start. The head elder continued, "We wish to honor you not just with words but with place. You may choose a role in the village that will allow your voice, and your strength, to serve us all." There was a murmur of agreement around the circle. Zuri, still standing in the center, let the silence stretch before she answered. "I don't seek power," she said simply. "I want only to ensure that no one else here wears chains for the sake of another's pride. If my story can do that, then give me a place where I can watch and listen. Let me be the one people can come to when they are wronged." The elders nodded. It was not a request for revenge but for vigilance, a kind of guardianship. And so it was decided. In the days that followed, Zuri's presence in the village changed the rhythm of things. People began to approach her with small disputes, with whispers of unfairness or cruelty. She listened, always without rushing to judgment, but with the kind of attention that made people feel their voices mattered. In time, those who might have acted unjustly began to think twice, knowing the girl with the singing chains legacy was watching. The chains themselves had not been hidden away. At the wedding's end, the broken links were gathered and set into the care of the village craftsman. He worked for weeks to reshape them, not into weapons or tools but into symbols. Each family received a single small charm, a ring of smooth iron to hang in their homes. These were not tokens of Zuri's suffering, but reminders of resilience and the way dignity can outlast cruelty. When the charms caught the wind, they rattled faintly, producing a sound so soft and fleeting that one had to pause and listen to hear it. And yet, when heard, it carried a strange comfort. Zuri and Amina's relationship was slower to mend. At first, their conversations were sparse, consisting mostly of polite exchanges in public spaces. But one evening, weeks after the wedding, Amina appeared at Zuri's door carrying a pot of warm stew. She lingered at the threshold, as though uncertain she would be welcome. Zuri stepped aside without a word, letting her in. They ate in silence at first. Then Amina set down her bowl and said, "I've thought of that night every day since. I wanted you gone from my wedding because I feared you would take the light from me. I didn't understand that you already carried a light that could not be taken." Zuri didn't answer immediately. She stirred the stew, listening to its soft bubbling. "The chains didn't sing because of me," she said finally. "They sang because they were tired of being used for harm. Anyone could have warned them and they would have sung the same." Amina smiled faintly, though her eyes were wet. "I don't think that's true." From that night on, the sisters' paths intertwined more easily. They were not the same as before, perhaps they never could be, but there was honesty between them now and a mutual recognition of each other's worth. As the seasons turned, the story of the singing chains spread beyond the village. Travelers carried it to neighboring towns, each retelling adding its own flourishes. Some claimed the chains had melted into silver ribbons. Others said they had burst into flowers. But in the village itself, the truth was kept simple. The chains broke because the spirit of the wearer would not bend. Years later, when children asked about the faint rattling charms in their homes, they would be told, "That is the sound of the chains remembering. They sing so we never forget." And when they pressed for the name of the girl in the story, their parents would smile and point to Zuri, still walking through the village with the same quiet grace, still listening when people came to her, still carrying the memory of weight transformed into freedom. In this way, her life became the living part of the tale, the part that couldn't be carved into metal or carried away in a song. And though the chains had long since lost their hold, the echo of their music would never fade.